Thanks, Scott. Good morning. It's great to be with everybody this morning. Uh, Bill and I have been in the insurance and risk management space for collectively, 58, pushing on 60 years. And we've been specializing in school risk management for 25 years. I'm the president of Highland Administrative Services, the administrator of the Ohio School Plan, and Bill Petro is our VP of claims for the Ohio School Plan. This is a shorter version of a longer presentation that Bill and I have given over the years. And the last time we did this specifically for OSBA was back in 2022, so just a couple of years ago. It's an important topic to understand because of how it impacts your districts and your district's leaders personally. And so as we step through that, just keep that in mind. And as Scott mentioned, we will address all the questions at the end. We're going to get through our slides. There's a lot of text on the slides so that you can have these to take back and refer to them later. So with that, we'll dive in here. And the analogy that we're going to use is related to buckets. All right, we're going to talk about the coverage lines within property and casualty and bonds using the analogy of buckets to demonstrate and to symbolize how the coverage parts are designed and how they're designed to stay separate and not overlap. So just from a high level, little foundational piece here, there's three buckets that we're going to be referring to this morning. We're going to be talking about the property bucket, which is first party damages, the casualty bucket, which is third party damages, and the bond bucket, which is a different animal. It's actually not insurance. It's a financial instrument, a contractual financial instrument. And each bucket is designed to fill a particular need for a particular purpose, and they don't overlap. They're designed not to overlap. So to think about this from a high level, first party damages, property damages, those are your district's assets, your possessions, your stuff, to use a very technical term. So your buses, your property, your autos, any of your contents, your buildings themselves. The casualty bucket, those are meant to cover third party and address third party liabilities. So auto injuries. So if there's a bus accident and if you injure somebody else, errors and omissions, and we'll hit on this a couple different times. Errors and omissions are mistakes you make that harm somebody external or third party to your district. Bodily injuries, employment related matters, failure to educate, IEP, civil rights, slips, trips, and falls, all the damages for third party claims. And then the bond bucket, which I mentioned is not insurance, are surety bonds, position bonds, and construction bonds, which many of you may be familiar with because of your building projects and your experience over the years. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill to talk a little bit more about some of these examples and reinforce the concepts.
Well, thank you, Mike. Sure. So remember, the buckets don't overlap. These are three separate buckets, and I'm going to try to give you some examples here just to flesh that out. Here we have a picture of a bus that hits an overhang, and in this example, students are injured. And so we have the bus that itself is damaged, and that's bucket one. That is your stuff that Mike says, your buildings, your buses, your equipment. Bucket one, that auto. We'll also hit the overhang. Now in this example, this is someone else's overhang, not yours. And so that falls into bucket two, this casualty bucket, damages that you might cause, that the school may cause to other people. And then we also have students on the bus who are injured. And again, that's bucket two, the casualty bucket, where your bus driver may have caused injuries or damages to someone else, in this case, the students. To change this example a little bit, because in this example, you have bucket two the building that they hit, someone else's building. But if we change it and you hit your own building, that would be bucket one, your building again, your bus, your building, bucket one. And just to mention again, these buckets don't cross over. They're three separate buckets. Go ahead, Mike. Sorry. Another example here, a school under construction, and Mike mentioned you may be familiar with construction bonds or the contractors might have on a project. And in this example, it's under construction, but the contractor goes bankrupt, goes belly up. And so the buckets here, we look at, so there's no bucket one, there's no damage to your property. And even in cases where under construction, there might be damage, there could be a fire, that type of thing. You don't own that building yet. You're not the owner under those contracts and that type of thing. So even then there's insurance that covers that. But in this case, no damage, nothing at all. We're just talking about the contractor going belly up. So no bucket one with your property. Bucket two is the casualty bucket, and the school didn't do anything wrong. The school didn't cause harm to anyone else. There's no damages or anything. So there's no bucket one and no bucket two, the casualty bucket. But what we're talking about here is that third bucket, the third bucket, the contractor's bond. And that bonding company, the surety, is guaranteeing the contractor's work and guaranteeing that their work will be done. And that's where the bond company, the bond comes into play. Bucket three. Again, they don't overlap. Keep saying that. So to get into this technical structure of this third bucket, the treasurer's bond in this case, which would be most familiar with, because your treasurers are bonded, they have to be bonded by the state. The surety bond guarantees that the tasks of the treasurer are being fulfilled. And this technical makeup, you have the principal, that's the treasurer, the individual that the bond is guaranteeing those tasks. You have an obligee, and that's the entity needing the tasks fulfilled. And that's either the school or the state, both require that. And then there's the surety company, of course, the bonding company that's guaranteeing these tasks will be done properly. And if there's a finding for recovery or something happens that the state comes in and audits and there's issues, problems, they could have a finding for recovery. The school makes this bond claim, the state can do that on your behalf. And that bond will come in and take care of that, because the bond guarantees the tasks will be done properly. Kind of makes sense there. Okay. I pause there just to give you a chance to see that if the surety, if the bond company makes a payment, the treasurer has to reimburse them. And this is how these surety bonds are all written. This is what the treasurer signs when that bond is issued. They expect to be reimbursed because the bonds don't protect the treasurer. They protect public monies. They protect the school's monies, the state money. They don't protect the treasurer. People and treasurers always ask the question, comes in here, why? Why is that? We'll get into that. We will get into that. That's an extremely important point to remember, that the surety makes a payment, They want reimbursed personally from the treasurer. So we get this question a lot. There's a question a lot. Why won't bucket 2 come into play here? If the treasurer messes up, why won't my errors and omissions coverage come into play? He made an error. He or she made an error. Why won't it come into play? And it's because there's a bond claim made and the treasurer makes an error with a financial error. Others outside of the school are not damaged or harmed. The school may be harmed. The school's funds may be harmed, but there's no injured like students. There's no one that slipped and fell and was injured. This is the school's funds that are missing, if you will. And so bucket 2, casualty bucket, won't come into play on that. So we give an example here, maybe these couples examples. Treasurer, payroll clerk, they don't faithfully perform their tasks. The school is damaged, not a third party. And so the E&O forms don't apply. Bucket 2 does not apply. And if you think about this other example, the school board and treasurer, they get sued by the payroll clerk. The clerk is alleging they were wrongfully fired. Now that's different, and that is under the E&O forms because she's damaged herself. She or he is damaged. And so these E&O forms do apply to an injury or damage to others. Bucket 2. Bucket 1, your property, your stuff. Bucket 2, casualty, damages or injuries you cause to others. Bucket 3 says surety bonds that cover your funds. As you mentioned, bucket 3. The position bond protects the district by guaranteeing these treasurers' tasks are done properly. And if they're not done properly, public funds are at risk. You mentioned finding for recoveries issued by the state against the treasurer or others. They're always issued against individuals. And this gets back to the why again, which we'll talk about in just a moment.
Yeah, and just emphasize Bill's point there before we get to the why. Bill and I have done a lot in our broader operation has done a lot to reinforce with the treasurers that your bond or your bond limit is not the same thing as your crime limit. So it's important to understand that's not what's being protected. The bond protects the school district's funds, protects the state, protects the school district. It did not protect the treasurer. So that's an important thing that we're trying to emphasize. We've done a lot of education around for the past several years.
Thanks, Mike. Get into the why. Mention the why. Why does the treasurer, this position bond, the treasurer's bond, why does the treasurer have to reimburse the school? Why? And this goes back through long history here in the state of Ohio. The state wants public monies protected. They want it to be properly accounted for. And so they want someone personally liable. The treasurer becomes personally liable. If there's a finding for recovery out of their own pocket, they have to reimburse that. You think in the private sector, it's totally different. If a treasurer for a large corporation screws up their job, doesn't properly account for funds that come into their hands, they might get fired, but they're not expected to personally refund that. If they steal, okay, that's different. That's different. We're not talking about that. We're talking about mistakes made, not properly doing their bonds, properly doing their job. That's what the bonds are there for. But public monies, the state requires these position bonds and requires the treasurer to be personally responsible. And this goes back to case law from 1929. I won't read a quote from that one. 1939 is another one. Public officers having control over public funds will be held personally liable for missing public funds. It's a long history there. Ohio Revised Code also requires it. So it's written right into the code, not just case law, but it's written into the code. All officials are liable for public money received or collected by them or by their subordinates under color of office. And then there's a attorney general opinion also on that. The public officials controlling public funds or property are liable for loss even if they're stolen, fraudulently attained by another, converted, misappropriated. So even things that the treasurer might not have control over, they could become responsible for if they've been stolen, misappropriated by others. Next slide. So to wrap this piece up, got the 3 buckets, 1, 2, and 3. Try to set that stage there because that's how it's been forever. It's 3 buckets, they don't overlap, and it was standard in the industry until just the past few years, and the laws changed. And so there's been a lot of questions about that, and Mike will get into that now.
Yeah, so where we are now, as Bill mentioned, there's been some changes over the past few years, 2 separate changes that have impacted how this operational risk is handled and financed. And House Bill 491 lessened the treasurer's strict liability, as Bill mentioned, under this section of the code. The treasurers still remain liable for loss when loss results from negligence or other wrongful acts. So the language is still fairly broad, but it's not as strict as it used to be. So there's some mixed news, good news, a little bit of bad news, but there is still liability there on the part of the treasurer and in other district leaders, but it's not as strict as it used to be. And then there have been further amendments to the code that now allows schools and other municipalities, but for our discussions this morning, it's specifically schools, to purchase insurance coverage in lieu of a position bond. And this insurance policy then is allowed to cover the treasurer's faithful performance of duty. So as Bill mentioned, the treasurer's tasks. And there was further clarification back in 2021 that then allowed for this change from a public official bond or a position bond to an insurance product during the district leader's contract term. So if your superintendents or your treasurer and business manager, or maybe even some of the board members were bonded and they're in the middle of their term, they're in the middle of their contract, there was question around if they could do that or have to wait until their contract came up, and the legislature did clarify that. So there's been some good developments in how the risk can be financed and covered and addressed, and then when to do it, and also it has lessened that strict liability to some degree. Now you might be asking, Mike and Bill, why did you not lead with this slide? And it's intentional because it's important for you as district leaders to understand how the mechanisms work why you're being asked, probably by your treasurers or your supers or other district leaders, to make a change in your policy. If you've been approached to make a change in your policy or you're considering it, this is why. Because the position bonds, these and bonds are still out there. Bonds have not gone away. They're still being used today. As Bill mentioned, they're used frequently in construction projects. They're also used in other fiduciary responsibilities, even outside of schools. If you're a treasurer for a small nonprofit board, you may be asked to be bonded because you're handling cash. So they still are a very valuable and important risk financing mechanism. And it's important for you to understand the ramifications they have to the individual person that's performing the duties and leading the district. So some good changes. In a couple of slides, we'll get into how you actually make the change. So we'll talk a second just about how they respond, how each of these instruments would respond. And we've got a real life claim example. It's the same claim example. The names have been removed to protect the innocent, but the payroll system was not updated to take STRS money from the employee and send it to STRS. Okay, it was just a simple mistake. There's no malfeasance. Nothing was stolen. It was more procedural, operational. And if the district purchased a bond on the treasurer, okay, and if the treasurer was to make the change, the insurance would not respond because there's a bond in place and bonded employees are excluded. Okay. Now, if the payroll clerk was responsible to make the change, insurance will pick it up. And the bond will respond to either situation. As Bill mentioned, it's a financial instrument and it's going to guarantee those tasks. The bond will respond just as a matter of course. It doesn't matter whose responsibility it was, who is at fault. If the bond's in place and not insurance, the bond will pay. However, the bonded employee is personally responsible to reimburse the surety company in this scenario. So same set of facts as the first example, but in this case, the district purchased insurance instead of a bond. And in both instances, if the treasurer was responsible to make the change, insurance will respond and pay. If the payroll clerk was responsible, insurance would respond and pay. And insurance, as long as Bill mentioned, as long as there's no theft, as long as there's no intentional crime, insurance isn't going to go back after the individuals for the money. Insurance just responds accordingly, according to the coverage form. So same set of facts, different mechanisms to finance it. And if the bond's in place, the bond will just pay. The insurance will cover it accordingly. But they have different impacts on the individual people involved. So how do we make the change? How does my district make the change? What do I have to do? You do have to understand that you do have to make the change. Because the law's in place, it just doesn't magically happen. You have to intentionally make the change to switch from utilizing a bond versus insurance. And the school must adopt by a policy or ordinance or resolution to allow the use of such an insurance policy to finance the coverage. The next step would be to make sure that you remove any bonded employee exclusions. Those exclusions are standard within the form. If a bond is in place, you're going to want to make sure you touch base with your insurance provider to make sure that exclusion is removed accordingly if you make the change. You also need to understand that you need to determine if well, we'll come back to that third bucket, or that third box there in a second. That's a little wrinkle we want to point out. So you need to consciously make the change by adopting a policy or an ordinance or a resolution. You need to make sure you're removing any bonded employee exclusions. Certainly decide on a limit. The change can be made during the individual's contract term. That was a clarification that the legislature made. And then we certainly recommend you talk to your legal counsel and your insurance professional, because there is a little bit of an inherent conflict in this conversation, right? As board members, you're looking at protecting the school's assets as well as you can, as is the treasurer and superintendent and business manager. However, there's that element of personal responsibility that is in play when bonds are utilized. And there's also, you know, the final comment, that green box there. There are districts that have both in place. Okay, we see districts that just use bonds exclusively to finance this risk. We see school districts that just utilize the insurance in lieu of a bond to finance the risk. And then we see districts that use both. They have a bond and for their treasurer, and they are also utilizing the insurance coverage. Both are used because there can be exclusions within the crime and the theft form in the insurance product. Okay, for example, there's a procedural thing. There's nothing stolen, but there's a finding for recovery because something wasn't approved correctly, and the treasurer is hit with a finding for recovery, but there's actually no theft, nothing's missing, and that may or may not be excluded in the insurance form. So the bond is there as a safety net to pick up anything that might fall through the cracks, you know, in the insurance product. And so a small bond is purchased for those type of things so that, you know, the district is protected. In the instance that there's two, a bond and the crime cover, it's important to determine from your carrier what's primary. So our position as the Ohio School Plan is that the crime will sit primary, and then the bond will sit secondary for anything else that just falls through the cracks. And again, Bill's been doing this a long time, and sometimes there's just claim scenarios we don't think of, and and there's exclusionary language that is in place that we you know, we didn't foresee having impact on certain scenarios. So another thing to consider. So the how, this is the slide for the how: adopting a policy or ordinance by resolution, certainly talking to board counsel and your insurance professionals to understand it, and you know, understanding there's a couple different ways to go about doing it, as far as all on the bonds, just on the insurance, or a combination of both. And there are sample policies and procedures out there. I think OSBA has access to them, as well as they're on the state auditor's site, and I believe OASBO has them as well. So that concludes our formal remarks. I don't know if there's any questions out there.
There's one question on the chat, and it was asking about insurance premiums that were not being deducted from the employee, and had been going on for perhaps 15 years. And the question was, where does that fall on the current treasurer who found it? Even if there's a audit and it currently have found that, it really goes back to who was there at the time, which treasurer was there at the time when that really first took place. You know, the state could make some argument that the current treasurer should have found it sooner, maybe within their first year or so, or whatever that is. But really, if bonds were in place, they were a position bond with that old treasurer's name on it. So if mistake was under their watch, that really where it goes to that bond at that time, even though they could be somewhere else at another district, even though they may be retired. If insurance was purchased, that would have been only within the past few years when the change is made. So really, these tend to go back. There's a long, I don't want to say multiple, every time a check is cut for that employee, there was a mistake. It really goes back to the original most of the time. So hopefully that answers that question. Really goes back to the treasurer who was in place at the time, who either made the mistake or should have caught it at the time.
Thank you. What if there were 4 different treasurers over the period of time?
State, if it's a finding for recovery, you want to work very closely with that auditor and with the state, because they do try to work with you on these and not, hammer somebody. They could, it's up to them, but I could see the scenario where they'd say, well, okay, the original treasurer made this mistake, but then you came on and you were there 4 years and you should have caught it. And then you came on, third treasurer, and you should have caught it. I have seen the state take very hard line on certain things. So my suggestion is, if the state's involved and auditor is involved, try to work with them on that.
But they would
Okay.
name, they could name each of them though, right? In that?
That's what I'm
Ye-
saying. They
Yeah.
could name everybody. Yes.
All right. What if the auditors aren't aware of the situation yet?
Sure. And that's why I say if the state's involved. So you've already probably tried, and I don't mean you,
Yes.
it's your example, tried to get the money back from the employee because they were really overpaid. Unfortunately, in Ohio, if you are freely given something, even by mistake, I've had these claims, and you go after the employee, they do not have to reimburse it. It would be nice if they do, or maybe over time they can make payments to reimburse that, but they don't have to. We tried to go after employees on different things, similarly overpayments, salary, different things, and the courts just basically could say you can't. So that's a tough thing to do. On smaller items, and the state's not involved, and it is a bond situation where it would go against a treasurer. I've seen treasurers just pay out of their pocket small dollars, a couple $1,000s, because they don't want a finding for recover on their bond. They don't want a payment on the bond. They don't want the nightmare. But you're talking about, 10 grand over 15 years. It's a lot of money. That's a tough situation. It's a very tough situation.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful.
Don't have a solid XYZ answer for you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good luck, Lisa.
Well, if you have any questions that come up after, our contact information is within the slides, so you can certainly reach out to Scott for any questions or comments. But we appreciate your time. We appreciate your attention. It's an important and technical topic, and it gets really touchy. So we appreciate your attendance and your questions here today. And thank you for all you do for our kids and for our schools all over the state. We really appreciate it.